Hello everyone. Welcome to this introductory video about our circular design training courses. These courses are brought to you in partnership with Orange Innovation Academy and Experience Design Lab, which, for those who don't know, is Orange Group's design center, part of the M&D and Innovation divisions. So as we're going to spend some time together, I'd like to present myself. I'm Pierre-Olivier Dubois, and I'm an expert in sustainable innovation, and here at Orange I have the honor of leading, amongst others, the Circular Design Program and the Circular Design Program team, which we'll come back to later in this presentation. And here you can see the three training courses we'll be looking at. For two of the courses we've chosen to work with a partner called Circulab, which, as you can see in the diagram, is more concerned with the upstream phase of the design process, the so-called think phase, which we'll come back to later, and which looks at the factors to take into account during the development of a product or service, resulting in a value proposition that is virtuous. And then there's a course for which we chose to work with the Fjord Agency, the world's second largest design agency after IDEO, and we'll also talk about IDEO right after that. And with Octo, when we look at the design doing phase, Octo Factory, both of which are part of the Accenture Group. So these are the three training courses that I would like to present today with this module. Before we get into the heart of the matter, just a quick reminder that seems appropriate. As you know, Orange has made a commitment as part of its Engage 2025 program, and even more widely, to honor a number of ecological commitments. The first of these, which I'm sure you all thought of straight away, is carbon neutrality by 2040. We've actually chosen, Stéphane Richard has chosen to bring forward by 10 years GSMA's recommended deadline for carbon neutrality in 2050. So you have an operator trying to go a little further than most of the other operators. And then there's another commitment which is extremely important and will be of interest as we proceed. It's our commitment to taking an eco-design approach for 100% of Orange's products and services, the products offered under the Orange brand. But there you go. They have to be part of an eco-design process, and we'll look at how circular design can be a useful tool in eco-design. That's the aim of this presentation. I'll start with an extremely important figure which you can see here. 80% of a product's environmental impact is decided during the design phase. That's not me saying this, and it's not the design teams either. It's the European Parliament's own research team. What this means is that the bulk of the impact of a product or service, its ecological impact, can be managed, controlled at the outset of the design process, of the innovation process. This is where the fundamental choices are made. This is where we decide on the direction we're going to take. This is where we select the partners we will work with. This is therefore where everything gets decided. The further upstream we get involved in the process, and we'll come back to this, the less impact we can have. And our strategy will be more one of mitigation rather than adaptation, which is what we're trying to do with circular design. So what exactly does that mean? To quote this advice given by Benjamin Parker to his nephew Peter Parker, otherwise known as Spider-Man, who I think you all know, with great power comes great responsibility. So yes, today we're lucky enough to work for Orange and be responsible for the instigation of a certain number of products and services that we make available to our customers. But as we deploy these services, we have the responsibility to deploy them virtuously. And this is what we propose to do with circular design. As you can see, our aim is to completely rethink the way we design, develop, and innovate, which means rethinking our processes, rethinking our tools, and in the end, completely rethinking our way of doing things, our vision of design and innovation at Orange. Which is fitting, because this is the essence of circular design, and I'm going to explain why that is in the next part of this presentation. Before we move on to that section, I'd like to take a step back and help you understand where circular design comes from, and how that stems from concerns about the place of ecology in design processes, since it's not a recent thing, as you'll see. Having started with Victor Papanek, you can see him on the slide there on the left in the photo, who, in his book, Design for the Real World, defined the foundations of what was to become eco-design and, later, circular design. History has progressed. Design thinking has evolved. We've progressed past the good principles of design, which you probably know about, to arrive a few years ago at the circular design philosophy. That was conceptualized and shaped into tools by Tim Brown and Ellen MacArthur. We'll look at that right after this. So, Tim Brown, who you see on the left, and Ellen MacArthur on the right, joined forces to define a new way of designing and innovating, taking into account core ecological issues, as we've just seen. So you need to know that Tim Brown is the inventor of design thinking. I'm underlining this because it's important for what comes next, and because he's also the inventor of circular design, and we'll see that it's an extension. Circular design is an extension of design thinking, which will become very clear. As you can see from the diagram, circular design embodies the combination of design thinking and the circular economy. In other words, the design practices inherited from Tim Brown and design thinking and the principles of circular economy. The two concepts collide, and the principles of circular economy are assimilated into design thinking. So to fully understand this integration, I'd like to bring you briefly back to the concept of circular economy. What is circular economy? It basically means to avoid producing waste and overuse of natural resources upstream of the product life cycle. It's a transition to a concept of life cycle that avoids these two problems, that for most of us are still an integral part of the design process, since, even today, we're more inclined to use raw materials in the production of products and services. And when these products and services arrive at the end of their life cycle, or when they're no longer usable, we simply throw them away. And this is what we're aiming to eliminate, exactly that. Avoid plundering natural resources. We're already well on the way to shortages of numerous essential raw materials, particularly metals, raw materials that are the bedrock of today's modern lifestyles. Raw materials such as lithium and copper are what we call rare earths. So these are all finite resources that we're abusing. In 200 years, we will have almost exhausted the natural deposits of these raw materials and thus deprive future generations. So we really have to avoid doing that. And then, as we said, we must avoid generating waste, plastic waste, found everywhere in our oceans. I'm not telling you anything new, but our lifestyles and production methods and today's modes of design are all based on the principle of linear economy, which we want to avoid by shifting to a circular economy. So we'll look at all these issues and their different impacts in a separate module that addresses raising awareness. Here's just one quick slide and a quick commercial to tell you about, it's not the subject of today's presentation, but if you wish, and if the project teams wish, and in any case, as part of the support process, we work on raising teams' awareness so that they understand what's at stake. And here I've deliberately chosen the impact of digital technology. Digital technology obviously has positive impacts and helps us in the transition to sustainable processes, but you cannot ignore the negative aspects and impacts of digital technology. It's vital to be aware of it. And, as we like to say in this training program, you have to start by identifying the problem to then be able to solve it. Turning a blind eye to problems caused by digital technology won't help us in our transition towards the virtuous products and services of tomorrow. I'll end this advertising spot and we can move on to an explanation of what exactly design thinking is. This is the upstream phase of the design process, as defined by the Design Council, the UK Design Council, and is divided into two phases. There's the think phase and the design doing phase. There's a slogan in English that's hard to translate into French, which doesn't really work well in French, but it basically says there is a first step, which consists of developing the idea and design for the right product, for the right value proposition, and only when you're sure that you have the right value proposition can you address how to design the product or service in the best possible way so that it corresponds to use cases, that it's a good fit with a certain number of criteria like accessibility, etc. But before we get to that part, we have to define the problem and the value proposition. And that's where the design thinking approach comes in. So as you can probably guess, it's a problem-solving approach, as our Anglo-Saxon friends say, consisting of defining the problem to find the right solutions. This is nothing new. We mentioned Papanek in 1972. But the idea that we need to take the time to clearly identify the problem is much older. So here I've given you two illustrious ancestors that you know perfectly well. And I'll just quote Albert Einstein, who said that if he had 1 hour in which to save the world, he would spend 55 minutes defining the issue, understanding it, and grasping it in all its complexity, and then 5 minutes would be enough to solve the problem. So I don't know if it's exactly this time allocation that we need to use, but in any case, you can see that the think phase is crucial and probably even more important than the actual creation of the product itself. And to bring this into the world of design and designers, we often use a quote here too. Don't ask a designer to design a bridge, but ask him for a way to cross the river, which basically amounts to saying use design thinking. So I'd like to underline this point, because at Orange, we currently tend to ask designers to draw a bridge. In other words, we start with the solution and ask the designers to execute it well, whereas the designer has been trained and has the tools and the capacity to be able to go back upstream to the think phase and help the project teams to find the right way to cross the river, which, by the way, may not necessarily be a bridge. We will now focus on what exactly circular design is and the specifics of this approach. So, as we've already seen, circular design is a combination of design thinking and circular economy. But it's more than just that. In fact, it's an extension of design thinking. And for good reason, since, as we've seen, Tim Brown was the inventor of design thinking, which was also the starting point for the development of circular design. And so, as you look at the diagram on the slide, what's actually happening? Starting with our analysis of design thinking and therefore economic viability, viability of usage, technical viability, we add a whole new field of analysis, that of ecology and sustainability, which effectively now gives us 4 fields of analysis versus 3 in design thinking. But the good news, for those already practicing design thinking, and we'll come back to this, is that it's not a fundamental change, since we remain within the same conceptual boundaries, the same dynamic of multidisciplinary collective working. So as you will see in the rest of this presentation, I'm not going to be talking about economic viability, viability of usage and technical viability, as these are already well developed within our organization. We'll look specifically at ecological viability, with the understanding, of course, that in circular design, we look at all 4 spheres together. The word together is important here, since ultimately it's at the intersection of these different spheres that we find the clearly identifiable opportunities and risks. Because in reality, we're intersecting sustainability in business, sustainability and usage, which we'll come back to, and obviously sustainability and technology. So, as I just said, it's an evolution more than a revolution. We'll look at a certain number of tools that people in design thinking are already familiar with, and we'll broaden these design thinking tools by integrating the concept of circularity. We'll push them towards ecological and societal concerns. And then there are also some new tools which enrich our approach, including some tools inspired by systemic design processes, which are ultimately the foundation, the core, the driving force at the heart of circular design. So we'll come back to the systemic aspects. And in fact, one of the training courses we're promoting through this video spends time on an in-depth look at the approaches of systemic thinking and systemic design. So on the slides you can see here are some examples of linear design thinking that has been curved back on itself. So we can talk about, for example, the circular business model canvas. Everyone has heard of the business model canvas. Most of you have probably already been using it for years. The main flaw of the business model canvas is that, as you've guessed, it does not take into account the ecological dimension and doesn't intersect business with ecology. This is something we can do with this new tool, or rather, this updated version, allowing us to incorporate this important aspect. And we do have some new tools, and I'll give you some examples. For your information, we have catalogued around 150 tools in the Circular Design Program Toolkit, and we're also on hand to support you through onboarding with these tools. We'll have the opportunity to come back to this later. We'll now look at core principles, our guiding principles. In the design world, we talk about the design principles on which we've based our circular design approach. So these core principles, there aren't many, 3, 4, or 5, we'll look at them all, but there's one that's extremely important, which is taking into account the entire life cycle of a product. And here we see an overlap with the principles of circular economy, since the concept of life cycle is at the very heart of circular economy. The life cycle is everything that's going to happen to produce a product or service, from the extraction of raw materials up to end of life and quite possibly the waste that may or may not be generated, which is precisely what we're trying to avoid. We're going to try to remain in a virtuous loop, as I was saying earlier, and therefore not generate any waste, but instead imagine a second life for the product itself, or for the raw materials it's composed of. So why do we do this? To better measure and be able to measure the various impacts across the entire value chain, not just in the usage phase that we saw at the bottom of the diagram on the previous slide. Since we're often only interested in the usage phase, to take the example of the electric car, I've put up a nice picture of a Tesla. In some countries, the use of electric cars will be a virtuous thing. This is the case of France, for example, which uses very low carbon footprint electricity. On the other hand, for a country like Poland, where most of the power stations are coal-fired, driving an electric car is actually worse than driving a fossil fuel-powered car, since coal pollutes much more than oil. But that's only looking at the usage side, which means we're not looking at the phases of manufacturing and the extraction of natural resources. And today we know that the electric car has a greater ecological cost to manufacture than an internal combustion engine, but it quickly catches up in its life cycle. And then there's the question of end of life that we were talking about earlier. The question of what's going to happen concerning recycling the car and its batteries, which you've probably heard about. So you have to look at the whole set of factors that determine what the impact is going to be and be able to calculate the energy balance and the overall ecological balance of the product or service we want to offer. So the life cycle is the core issue here. You can see that throughout the life cycle we have a host of opportunities that we can identify on this slide here. As I mentioned earlier, the circular design approach focuses not only on discovering risks, but also on revealing opportunities, business opportunities for the company. A second core principle that we've already looked at is having a systemic approach, understanding how the whole system functions around the product or service, understanding its interdependencies. Here I've given you an example of systemic mapping that we did for a project, the Cloud PC project, in which you can see a certain number of aspects with positive and negative feedback loops. And finally, how all of this impacts the human ecological system around the product or service. So we're not just focusing on the usage phase. We don't just stay focused on the product or service. We take a step back, and with a certain distance we can try to understand the interactions and interdependencies within the system. Again, to illustrate my point, here's an example of the One Health concept, which you may have heard of. Until quite recently, human health professionals, environmental health professionals, and animal health professionals were highly compartmentalized disciplines with little communication between the fields. But as time went on, they became aware of the interdependencies between these different areas, and that ultimately human health was dependent on the health system, the environment, and on animals. That animal health was dependent on human health, environmental health, etc. An excellent example that we've been thinking about recently is COVID-19, which, as you may know, is a zoonotic disease. What are zoonotic diseases? They're diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans, and which tend to be transmitted at increasingly faster rates as we eliminate the buffer spaces between wild animals and the zones occupied by humans and their domestic animals, especially livestock. As a result of removing these buffer spaces, we put the livestock in direct contact with pathogens, which can then be transmitted to humans, affecting human health. So the more we destroy forests and wild areas and artificialize the soil, as we are currently doing, the more we're going to have zoonotic problems, and the more we'll see the appearance of pathogens like COVID-19 and others. So it's important to remember that 60% of human infectious diseases, as shown on the slide, have an animal origin. So it's all interdependent, and that's what we're going to try to understand in designing our product or service. How are we going to impact society, humans, and the planet? When we carry out sustainability analyses, it's to anticipate the medium and the long-term impacts of what we usually do during design thinking. We carry out impact analysis, but we tend to look at it in the short term, whereas the real impacts are going to happen over time. When we launch a product or service, it's not going to be around for just 2, 3, or 4 years. What we have to do is look at what's going to happen in the longer term. And to do that, within the circular design approach, we often use another method, another discipline, which is design fiction. We project ourselves ahead into the medium and long-term future, trying to anticipate possible world developments and change, both utopian and dystopian. And we'll look at how our innovations, how our products and services will resonate in these imagined futures. As on previous occasions, I'd like to give you a concrete example, in this case Airbnb, which you've certainly heard about, who didn't anticipate in the medium and long term to what extent Airbnb's business model was going to pose problems for many towns and cities, because, as you know, numerous issues have been caused by the Airbnb model. For example, when you have a building where half the apartments are Airbnb rentals, as can be seen in Lisbon, with people passing through every other day, lugging their suitcases up and down the stairs, and who are there to party and make a lot of noise, obviously, this is a direct nuisance for the other residents of these buildings. And then we've seen a phenomenon in a number of European capitals where the simple fact of Airbnb moving into these cities has had a huge effect on real estate prices. And as a direct result, the inhabitants of Lisbon, for example, are no longer able to afford the real estate in the city where they were born, because the massive investments made by lots of Europeans in this city have caused real estate prices to skyrocket. So that's something that could have been anticipated with the tools offered by circular design, and once again by looking at the medium and long term. On top of all this, there's a driving force which is extremely important in circular design methodology. We've seen that we are trying to reduce the impact on ecosystems as far as possible. And what we're trying to do now is to be even more virtuous. We're trying to go one step further and regenerate the ecosystems. We haven't had the opportunity to look at it in this video, but here too we have a presentation on the subject as part of the circular design program. We've caused serious damage to Earth's systems, whether it be the atmosphere, cryosphere, the pedosphere, the lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere. Everything is in a catastrophic state. So we need to be able to restore it all. We have to manage to rehabilitate it all. We can't just settle for carbon neutrality as the diagram shows, but we need to have a positive remedial action. We're going to try as much as we can in the processes we're going to implement in our circular design and in the value proposition we're going to propose with our product or service to try to have the most positive impact on our ecosystems, on the planet and on humans. So not settling simply for neutrality. And finally, with all of that, the circular design approach will result in our being able to propose decision-making tools, informing decision-making by integrating factors that are not currently taken into account in deciding whether or not to launch a product or service. Today, we look to see if there's obvious business potential in its deployment. Over the past few years, we've become increasingly interested in what users think and if it actually corresponds to a genuine use case. And then after that, we can integrate these new parameters, the ecological parameters and societal parameters. And this can look like the kind of matrix graph you see here. We'll be able to position the products and services to decide whether the return is worth the time and investment, and if the product or service we're about to launch corresponds to the commitments Orange has set for itself, particularly in terms of carbon neutrality by 2040, as I explained in the introduction. And in relation to the eco-design goals that we're trying to achieve by 2025, again, 100% of Orange products will have an eco-design approach by 2025, which is almost upon us. And since we know that the average product cycle at Orange, between the moment we have the idea or value proposition and the moment it goes to market is 2 to 3 years, this means that all the products we're working on today should already have an eco-design approach. Using circular design, as you can see on this slide, we address a number of issues. We won't have time to go through them in detail here, but there are a number of issues that can be addressed during the main phases. So there you have the two sides of the double diamond diagram, which we saw in the introduction, with, similar to design thinking, the aspect of opening and closing, of divergence and convergence. And then we have a certain number of challenges. And these challenges are as much business as they are usage, technical and ecological. Once again, it's at the crossroads of these different issues that we'll identify the right ideas, the best products and service opportunities to design and produce for our customers. The idea behind it all is actually quite simple. Defining a new paradigm for value creation that's not just business-centric, but centered on values that are the other values which Orange is aspiring to, including those specified in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with which we are currently aligning ourselves. So going beyond the simple cornerstone of business, which is still important and will always be our core driving force, because after all we're not an NGO, but with new considerations that will influence the pure business dimension, the new parameters that will, as I said earlier, define whether or not it's relevant to launch a particular product or service. Now I'd like to look at the conditions for success of a circular design approach. Because, as you'll see, you can't apply this kind of approach to just any context, to any project. As you've probably understood, the idea here is to concentrate our efforts on the upstream phase. To initiate a circular design approach, we have to get involved as early as possible in the project design process. If everything has already been thought out, already been worked out, then we're already talking about the solution, which, as we've said several times, is not necessarily the best time to apply the circular design approach, whose role is to question the underlying issues, to question the value proposition, to turn it into something that will lead to a more virtuous product. So the advantage, as we've just seen, of starting upstream is that the further upstream you start, the greater the ecological impact. As a reminder, what we saw in the introduction was that 80% of the impact of a product or service is decided at the very beginning, in thinking about the value proposition. So it's at this point that we're going to have the maximum impact. If we get involved early enough, we'll really be able to implement a strategy of adaptation, not a strategy of mitigation. If we become involved later in the process, the mitigation strategy we talked about earlier would be trying to reduce the impact we're going to have, using less energy, using less water. but we'll nevertheless have some impact on the planet and on humans. So the idea is really to become part of the process as early as possible. That's what we're trying to explain in this slide. And then there's another condition for success that's also extremely important. It's that, as we've said many times now since the beginning of this video, if we start with the solution, that's a problem. So the trend that we're seeing in large companies, and Orange in particular, is to have products based on technology push strategies. This is where we start with a technical solution and then try to imagine uses for it. In this context, we can jump in with circular design and make some improvements to the product. But we'll still be in mitigation mode, and the same is true with a market pull scenario. Market pull means simply following the market without asking any questions at all, without considering the underlying issues and their impact. And so, these two scenarios where we start with the solution are problematic. And there's also a middle path, which is where we look at usage and impacts, where we ask ourselves the right questions from the outset. That's what design thinking does. That's what all problem-solving approaches do. And it's within this project context that the full impact and potential of circular design becomes apparent. As I was saying, at Orange and XD Lab we have a dedicated team, the team I'm lucky enough to lead, which proposes a certain number of things, tools, operational support and so on, that we're going to look at in this video. So the circular design program is organized around two pillars, as you can see on the screen, an operational support pillar and a methodology support pillar. What do we mean by methodology support? This is the toolbox we were talking about earlier, containing around 150 tools. These are the best practice guides, such as the guide describing the 44 things to look at in circular interfaces when making a circular interface. These are just a few examples, and then there's the operational support section. So myself and the people in my team get involved in the projects to help set up a sustainable innovation process, and above all, to produce actionable elements. We saw an example earlier, the example of systemic mapping. So we're here to accompany this transition, to help Orange make more virtuous products. As you can see, the idea is to integrate ecological concerns at every stage of the design process. We saw at the beginning that in each phase of the double diamond you see here, both on the think phases where it's going to be very important, but also in all design doing phases too. And that's what we just saw with the example of interfaces and the issues we need to address concerning our digital products. So what actually is the purpose of this team of experts? It's here to help you contribute to Orange's strategic ecological objectives, the ecological and sustainability concerns, and the commitments the company has made. I won't talk about it again, I'll just put the slide up as we've already talked about it several times. Orange has a commitment, so that means all its products and services have to be pushed in that direction. And we're here to help you achieve this, to help you reach Orange's goals. Our team of experts also plays a part in supporting Orange's eco-design approach. So I should point out here that for 2 years now we've been working on this process. It was created and put in place as a joint project between Orange and Ginkgo 21, who defined the 15-step process which you must follow, and has benchmarking goals for each of these 15 steps. So we're here to support and monitor the co-design process at Orange, as you've seen. There is also our meaningful innovation process, which is the approach of the marketing and design entity which XD Lab belongs to. As you can see, it's based on the same principles as circular design. And in fact, these principles were inspired by Tim Brown and the circular design approach. So here we're obviously, naturally, completely governed by this approach, this process, this framework. So as I was saying, and this is to illustrate my point a little more, we have our guidelines, we have a toolbox. We provide information about how to get started with the toolbox. Which tools should be used at each stage of the process? What's the goal of each one? All of this is relatively well explained. And then we also have a process geared towards raising awareness, which is integrated into the projects. But we have also done this outside of our projects. If you go to design.orange.com or onto Plaza or even onto the Orange Learning website, you'll find articles and conferences that we've given on a number of ways to approach sustainable innovation. I've put a few examples on this slide. As I was saying, we've provided operational support for a number of projects. I've put some examples on this slide too, along with some examples of proposals we've been able to make. You can also see an example of systemic mapping that I mentioned a moment ago. And then we have a range of services that can be adapted quite easily to all project constraints and to all different team profiles that you may encounter. So we have a service offer which is built around 4 main service blocks. Speed consulting, which is a service offering that's compact in terms of time, very compact in fact, since it's a 30-minute consultation. More often 45 minutes, to be honest, with a project team to give them some recommendations. So how's it structured? There's an initial 10-minute period for the project team to present their particular situation and ecological concerns. And then for the next 20 to 40 minutes, we give them recommendations on methodology, tools, and strategies. So this is a very short format that's easy to implement. Once a month, we spend an afternoon doing this, and we talk to a certain number of teams that we're trying to get on the right track. There are our strategic workshops. What is a strategic workshop? It's a one-off session lasting half a day or a whole day, where we focus on one specific issue out of the list of issues we mentioned earlier. So, for example, we'll give support to the project team on how to rework a value proposition to make it more virtuous. Or further downstream in the process, we'll look at the interfaces that the team has created and try to optimize their interaction design, the UX aspects, and also the interfaces themselves, tweaking their graphics choices and looking at the code too. And please note that there is in fact a training course in eco-design software offered by ITS that's geared towards this process. We'll come back to this later. What is project onboarding? This has an even broader scope. We take the entire project team, a multidisciplinary team, through a week-long design sprint. So what exactly do we do during this week? We try to achieve 3 goals. The first goal is making the team aware of the ecological issues. The second is bringing the team in line with the strategic issues, as you saw earlier, the strategic issues that reflect the ecological concerns. And then we also call in our coaches, as we're lucky enough to have several coaches on the Circular Design Program team, and we try to unite the whole team around this common project. So there's an overall goal of bringing teams together, of alignment and awareness during this design sprint session. And finally, the last building block in our service offering is end-to-end support. What usually happens is that we'll take a project brief from people who want to move towards a more virtuous product or service. We make them a proposal, assisting them with methodology, and we provide support on a daily basis. The 2 possible scenarios are either we help and advise a designer who's already working on a project, in which case we'll have a mentoring role, or we assign a circular designer to the project ourselves, who then takes on the role of design producer within the project. So, as you can see, we are able to adapt to any situation, and we can spend a lot of time with you, or not, depending on your specific needs, for integration of these ecological concerns. And finally, we come to our 3 training courses. Why are there 3 courses? As I said in the introduction, there are 2 training courses that we run with Circulab. The first course is aimed at all the people involved in the design process. So it's not just aimed at designers, contrary to the other 2 training courses, which really are dedicated to an audience of designers and coaches. This one involves spending 5 days getting to grips with the principles of circular design and understanding the principles of systemic thinking. This course has a lot of theoretical content, but it also has a number of practical workshops and gives the opportunity to look at 3 tools that are used all the time in the circular design process. As I've already mentioned, there's the circular business model canvas. There's the value chain canvas, which looks at all possible impacts during the life cycle, and the partner map, which allows you to map the topography of the company's entire partnership environment and to find new business opportunities for the product or service we're trying to bring to market. So that's the first training course.
La deuxième formation, c'est une
The second course is an extension of that. As you can see in the diagram, there's a small arrow. It's the second part of the course. In the first course, we're in the role of participants in the circular design process.
s'adresse plutôt aux designers.
And the second course is aimed more at designers and transition coaches, designers with more of a service design profile and design thinking.
Et l'idée là,
And the idea here is to manage and streamline the circular design process. We go deeper into the detail of the principles of managing a process and also practical usage of the tools offered by Circulab. This is mainly based around stimulus for the ideation phase, a lot of which obviously doesn't necessarily interest everyone involved in the design process.
dans le processus de
That's why we split it into two separate courses. Whereas our initial idea was to have one single training course, but in any case, it would have been too long.
jour et demi pour vraiment
So now we have an extra day and a half to really work on this area of facilitating and management. And the last one, which is brand new, looks at the implementation of an end-to-end circular design process.
cette formation.
In other words, in this course, we focus on the entire design doing phase, which is something we didn't do with Circulab.
On va dans la deuxième partie, donc dans le deuxième diamant,
In the second part, in the second diamond, we're going to take a look, as we said earlier, at how we're going to give the product or service the best possible design.
designer possible.
And so we look at defining functional units and see how we can make these functions more optimal.
On rend ces fonctions les plus optimales finalement. Pour finir, l'idée, vous l'avez compris.
And finally, the idea, as you can see, is to bring our company into the 21st century and address the concerns of the 21st century. I think this will speak to everyone, given the summer we've just been through, and I think there's a growing awareness of ecological issues, which is becoming more and more widespread. And this means citizens, as well as local authorities and companies, making the switch. And that's what we propose to help you do with our circular design teams.
Design circulaire. Je termine cette intervention en vous laissant avec
I'd like to end this presentation with a quote from Bergson, which you can see on the screen.
l'arrivée
The future is not what will happen to us, but what we will do.
de créer un futur souhaitable.
So there you have it. It's up to each of us to create a desirable future for everyone. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon at the training sessions.